Okay, good evening, and thank you for joining us. We are Creation Fellowship virtually there. We have been meeting since 2012 and virtually via Zoom since May 2020. You can find us on Facebook as Creation Fellowship Santee and on Podbeam and Apple Podcast as CFS virtually there. Tonight, we have with us an archaeology specialist and author and a man finishing his master's in Egyptology degree. And his name is Nate Loper. And he is a former executive director at Canyon Ministries, where I believe he still works. Nate has been a guide in museums and national parks for over 20 years and also leads international tours in both England and Egypt, focusing on church history, creation science, and biblical archaeology. Nate is immortalized at his website, canyonministries.org. Note, we have the Great Commission from Matthew 28:18 through 20 in the ESV, which is written, "And Jesus came to them and said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." We are to be obedient to the faith and bold. In 1 Peter 3:15 in the ESV, it is written, "But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect." And of course, in Jude 3, we are told to earnestly contend for the faith. And that's exactly what it means. So that is what Nate is going to be doing tonight. So here's Nate.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve, for that marvelous over-the-top introduction. Love to see you guys here. It is great to be back with Creation Fellowship, Santee. And yes, I absolutely am still with Canyon Ministries. My role has transitioned from executive director now to director of ministry outreach. So that just means I get to travel more, speak more, and connect more with people. And so that is right up my alley and what my heart is all about. So apart from that, like you mentioned, we lead tours in both the UK and over in Egypt. And here, just in a few weeks, leading an 11-day tour over there in Egypt. So, talk a little bit briefly about that. But tonight, we're going to talk about geology of the Giza Plateau. And so that is kind of a fun topic. We're going to talk about a little geology. We're going to talk about a little bit of archaeology and a little bit of history. We're going to throw in a lot of different things tonight. And so, geology of the Giza Plateau really is the main topic of this talk tonight, or as I like to call it, a big block rock talk. And we're going to talk about some big blocks of the pyramid. So, the big block rock talk. We're also going to have a lot of fun tonight as well. So, that's going to be a big part of what we're going to be covering is Egypt, some Egyptology, some history, and of course, a lot of fun. So, Steve, as you mentioned, we do lead tours over in Egypt. And so this is more of a new tour company that we're starting up here, EgyptChristianTours.com. So, leading an 11-day tour coming up very shortly with Dr. John Delancey from Biblical Israel Ministries and Tours. And so, we're co leading that. And that'll be exciting coming up here very soon over there in Egypt. And so, if you guys want to learn more about that, you can jump on EgyptChristianTours.com. It also has a link there to Dr. John Delancey's website as well for that information. But exciting stuff. Tonight, we're going to focus on just a few things. There's so much we could cover about Egypt. But tonight, we're specifically focusing on geology and really a very centralized location, the Giza Plateau, which, of course, the Giza Plateau is the most famous location of all of Egypt. This is where the pyramids are at. This is where the Sphinx is at. And so the Giza Plateau is an uplifted plateau region that you can see right outside of Cairo. And so if you go Cairo, the kind of western side of Cairo is called Giza. And so once you kind of cross the Nile River, you're into Giza. And then just a little bit further west is the Giza Plateau itself. And so that Giza Plateau is where the pyramids, like I said, are at. Now, if you've been to Egypt, you probably see a view quite similar to this. And this is a view showing you the three main pyramids on the Giza Plateau, the Great Pyramids, if you will. However, if you've been to Egypt, you also know that depending on where you stand, your perspective of those pyramids, their size and the view also varies greatly. So in this kind of stacked view, if you will, you're looking at these three pyramids, and it's kind of hard to figure out which one is the Great Pyramid. And interestingly enough, the Great Pyramid, the big main one, is all the way in the back there to the right. That is the Pyramid of Khufu off in the distance. Now, the angle and the perspective distance makes it deceptive and deceiving. The middle pyramid you can see right there, that is the pyramid of Khafre. And then the one kind of closest in the image there, that is a pyramid of Menkaure. And so the oldest, middle, and then the newest one of all those three, kind of a grandfather, son, or grandfather, different generations, grandfather, son, and then his son going in that direction. And then you see three small little pyramids up there. Those we oftentimes call the Queen's Pyramids. They're kind of satellite pyramids that are oftentimes reserved for queens or for royal family members. So this is a view that you would see from one perspective of the pyramids, but the kind of straight on view would be something more like this, which actually shows you the kind of true size of some of these pyramids. Now, the Great Pyramid on the right you see is actually kind of angled, so it looks bigger because you're kind of looking at it from an angled side view. But that's the Great Pyramid on the right, Pyramid of Khufu, the Pyramid of Khafre right there in the middle, and the Pyramid of Menkaure over there to the left. And you can see the actual kind of true size difference in these pyramids. So these pyramids sit up on the Giza Plateau. They're on the west side of the Nile, which is kind of typically reserved for the place of burial for royalty. Kind of on the west side of the Nile, that's where the sun goes down. And so, kind of in their cycle of how they see life and death, the sun rises in the east, it brings life to the land. The sun sets in the west, kind of a closing of the life. So typically, most of your burial spots are usually going to be on the west side of the Nile. And so around Cairo, where ancient Memphis was at, this is where the great burial place was at. And so they have a lot of burials. And so these great pyramids, these are what we're going to feature and focus on tonight. So this is a view actually from my hotel room or hotel that I stayed at the first time I went to Egypt a few years ago. And so this is a great view to go to sleep to, wake up in the morning and see this view. But if you look here, you can actually see the plateau itself rises up into the distance. To get to the pyramids, to get up on top there, you actually do kind of climb up onto a plateau. And that's why we call it the Giza Plateau. Now, there's a huge necropolis site, basically a place of burial, a city of the dead, you might say. And so this giant Giza necropolis houses the pyramids, houses many, many, many other burials of both royalty and commoners. It also features things like the Sphinx, of course. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those things. But what I want to do tonight is to really talk about the pyramids in a way that helps us understand when they were built, who built them, and to maybe dispel a few bad ideas or bad conspiracies, you might say, out there. So when it comes to Egypt, there are lots of different questions that a lot of people ask. They have all kinds of questions about the pyramids and lots of different things. But the number one question we typically get regarding Egypt is, who built the pyramids? That's kind of the number one question. Who built those pyramids? And so there are lots of different ideas, lots of different theories. People sometimes get confused about them. And over the years, I have heard all sorts of different possible questions, theories, ideas, some really out there ideas. But everything from were they built by some ancient lost civilization? Were they built by giants? Or how about aliens? Of course, we hear that one. Were the pyramids built by aliens? So let me quickly answer that and say, no, they weren't. Get out of here with that idea. So no, the pyramids were not built by aliens. We actually have a pretty good perspective of when the pyramids were built and who built them. But of course, the question still kind of lingers in people's minds regarding the building of the pyramids. When were they built? How do we know that they were built by ancient Egypt? Is that just what people are telling us? And of course, in today's, you might say, YouTube society, where everybody has a personal blog and a conspiracy idea, there's a lot of bad information that goes around that we really try to tackle. And we need to do that. We need to tackle some of these theories because we need to, as the Bible encourages us to do, to test all things, right? To test those things and see if there's truth and validity. And even within the creation movement, we also need to test our theories. We need to examine the evidence firsthand and hold to those things which have support, which have great ideas, and to be willing to let go of theories or ideas that just don't hold water, don't add up necessarily. And so that's part of what we like to do is trying to examine, what does scripture say? What does science say? What does archaeology say? Where do these things come together? So because tonight we're in a creation science group, we are going to start with a few assumptions. Otherwise, it would be a whole different talk. And the assumption we're going to start with is we do believe the Bible is true cover to cover, which means that we do believe that God created all things within 6 days, rested on that seventh day. We do believe that there really was a global flood, just as the Bible talks about. And so looking at those events of Scripture give us an understanding of the history that is laid out in front of us. So we'll start with those assumptions. The talk that I'm giving tonight is going to be based upon those assumptions of God's creation, of a timeline laid out in the Bible, and of a real, true global flood. And so because of that, we're going to kind of skip through some of the descriptions of the flood necessarily and just start looking at the archaeology and the geology of this Giza Plateau. If you want to have questions about the flood, when it happened, all the truth of that, that's a whole different talk. And I know you guys have some fantastic videos already on that. But we're going to examine a few things. We're going to examine that question of who built the pyramids. Fortunately, we have a pretty good record, pretty good understanding, not just because of the civilization and the remnants and the things that we still see left behind there, but we also have pretty good evidence that's been left behind even in writing. So tonight, as we dive in, we're going to go through some fun topics. We're going to come fast paced, but we're going to try to get it all covered within this hour. So one of those great evidences that we see for who built the pyramids comes to us from what's known as the Diary of Merer. So we pull back the curtain, set the stage. We start off with a fantastic piece of evidence that kind of gives us an understanding of, when the pyramids were built and who built them. We have this Diary of Merer. Now, the Diary of Merer that you see here was written by an Egyptian foreman, you might say, and his name was Merer. So this foreman over there in Egypt, he was in charge of the construction and the cutting and transportation of some of the limestone blocks that were used to actually build the pyramid of Khufu, the Great Pyramid, the largest of all those pyramids. So Merer records in his diary, you might say, this events taking place. They talk about, the cutting and the transportation of the blocks. He writes about Khufu's brother, who was actually in charge, it seems, of the whole pyramid construction itself. But Merer was a kind of a lower foreman, you might say, and he was helping cut and transport the blocks from Tura, the white limestone blocks from Tura. They were transported along the Nile, took to the other side of the river, and then dragged up to make the casing stones for the Great Pyramid. So Merer wrote this papyrus, and so sometimes it's known as the Diary of Merer, and other times you might just say it's the Merer Papyrus. But this was discovered, and the writing, this is actually the oldest known written papyrus we have to date, which is pretty fascinating. And it's more fascinating because it describes, it names and mentions the pyramid, the Great Pyramid being built for Khufu. And so on this, you kind of see the blown up section here. We actually have what's called a cartouche, which is kind of that rounded oval symbol you see there. There's actually one up at the top left. There's one near the bottom right, a little bit more faded. But we have the cartouche, which is the royal name for a pharaoh or a leader or a ruler. They are circled and have a little name ring with a little foot base there. This is known as a cartouche. The French archaeologists named it a cartouche because it reminded them of a cartridge or a cartridge, cartouche that we put bullets into. And so they called it the cartouche. And so in cartouches, you typically have names of rulers or leaders or pharaohs. And if you can't quite figure it out on the page here, let me highlight it for you. There you go. That is the cartouche. This is actually the cartouche of King Khufu, Pharaoh Khufu. And let me see, bring up the laser point. I can show you where it is. So this is the cartouche you see right here. And this has the name of Khufu. Now, if you're familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphic symbols, you might say these don't quite look like typical hieroglyphs. And you're right. These are what we refer to as hieratic. This is a type of kind of quick writing. Usually, this is what the common person is going to write in. It's almost like Egyptian cursive or Egyptian shorthand, and it's much easier than taking and creating the entire signs and symbols of traditional hieroglyph signs. This is very quick writing. But this is the cartouche for Khufu. Over here, we have kind of what they believe to be a representation of either a placenta or some kind of like basket sieve. This makes a k sound, like a KH, k. Over here, this is a quail chick, which makes like an oo, kind of a W, but makes a oo sound. This is hard to see, but this is a horned viper, which makes the F sound, and then another quail chick right here. Together, you would read it from right to left and then going down, Ku Fu. So this is the name of Khufu. The Merer Papyrus mentions the pyramid of Khufu and mentions Khufu by name. So fascinatingly enough, we actually have a written record from the time of when the pyramid was being built, written by one of the construction leaders who's actually overseeing the building of the pyramid. So yeah, we do have written record of the pyramids being built. And I have had lots of discussions with lots of people who say there's no record of the pyramids being built ever. And I had to say, well, that's not exactly true. We do have records, and here's one of the great ones that was discovered actually not too many years ago. And this piece of fantastic evidence. So when it comes to the pyramid, one of the other things people say, well, wait a minute, the pyramid, there's no evidence of any writing within the pyramid. There's no written inscriptions in there naming in anything that you might find. And it's true that the Great Pyramid lacks the typical inscriptions that you would see developed later on that kind of talk about the journey through the afterlife and all the different, spells you might say that are written on the tomb walls. We don't yet have that developed in Egyptian pyramids yet at that point. But what we do have are actually some fascinating things that were discovered that actually do have writing in the pyramids. Not your typical hieroglyphs, but we have writing in the pyramids written from the pyramid builders. And so we've actually discovered, going back all the way to the 1800s, there's about a dozen different written names of Khufu deep within the pyramid. Some of these places were completely inaccessible until recently, or until you got ladders and were able to go way up into like the vault areas where the supporting structures were built deep within the pyramids. These are areas that were never meant to be seen. And what we find is basically graffiti or written words from the pyramid builders themselves, from the workers that were building the pyramids. This is a great one. Here's another cartouche that you can see right here. And in this cartouche, we have the name of Khufu once again. We have K over here, a quail chick U, a horned viper here, and another quail chick, Khufu. This is Khufu's name written sideways in a cartouche. And over here we have basically Smer U Upper, which means the workers or the gang, the friends or companions of Khufu. So this is an inscription of some of the workers, a work gang that were in charge of building things, and the name of the pharaoh that they were working for. So basically calling themselves the friends or the companions of Khufu. We also have within the pyramids places that nobody has ever seen until recently when they actually sent robots with cameras into small little tiny tunnels and they looked around. They actually saw that there were written mathematical equations and measurements and things like that written inside the pyramids. Places that nobody has even been to this day. No human eye, as far as I know, has seen it with their own eyes. We've just seen it with robotic cameras. But we do see that, yes, there is written evidence of the Egyptians building these pyramids, and it's found within these walls. So if anybody tells you there's no writing within the pyramids, there's no evidence that the Egyptians ever built them, you kind of have to say, that's not exactly the case. We do have evidence. It's deep within the pyramids, and it's fascinating stuff. I love this kind of thing, these hidden secrets. So, of course, we look at when the pyramids would have been built and who would have built them. We do see that, yes, Egypt was in power, was basically there very shortly, very soon, we believe, after the flood and probably after the Tower of Babel event. We see in Scripture, Genesis 10, verse 6, talks about the table of nations and people groups and things like that. And it mentions the sons of Ham. So Ham was one of the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And it references and talks about the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan or Canaan. Now, Mizraim is the name of Egypt, and some Bible translations actually translate it and say Egypt. And so your Bible might say Egypt, your Bible might actually say Mizraim, and that is the name of Egypt. And in fact, that name Mizraim or Misr is still the same name that Egypt uses to this day in even the Arabic community to refer to Egypt. That's what they call themselves. Like the Bank of Egypt, the kind of Egyptian national bank is the Bank Misr. Or if I were to say to you, Ana kalim Arabi Masri shweya, that basically means I speak a little Egyptian Arabic. Arabi Masri, Misr, from Egyptian Arabic. So they still use the biblical name that we see in Genesis that is still used over in Egypt. The Egyptians refer to themselves as Masri, as the Egyptians, coming from that name, Misraim. Fascinating. Thousands of years, and that biblical name we still see there. So when we look at this, we can see that that name, Misraim, Egypt is an early group that comes into this land and begins to develop and to grow and to build things. And so over years, we see development of language and of culture, of architecture, of design. We see a kind of a progression of development of these pyramids. And so starting with these mastaba-like tomb coverings, and eventually they're stacking mastabas, and eventually they build these pyramids, and it takes a lot of time and to figure out how to build the pyramids. And for a while there they don't actually get it quite right, and then eventually they figure out the right angles, the right size, the right steps to take, and then we eventually take off and we get grand, huge, monumental structures that are built. So yeah, I would say absolutely aliens did not build the pyramids. The Egyptians built them. We do have good physical written evidence of the Egyptians, and we have other things written in inscriptions and references back to the pyramids. So there's a lot of good evidence there to say, yeah, the Egyptians built the pyramids. So next question we typically often get is, of course, when were the pyramids built? There are lots of different ideas. A lot of people scratching their heads out there saying, when were the pyramids built? And if you watch documentaries, there are things all out there from all different perspectives. And well, unfortunately, you might hear that the pyramids, maybe that they predated ancient Egypt and maybe from an advanced civilization or culture that disappeared. You might hear things about the pyramids being much older, or there's even ideas even within creation groups, unfortunately, where they like to say maybe the pyramids were pre-flood. And I would have to say not likely, because Misraim, the son of Ham, came after the flood, right? So if you're looking at biblically speaking, that's not going to add up. A few years ago, I was actually in a creation group, must have been, 15 some years ago. And at a talk somebody was giving that night, he trying to make the case that the pyramids were pre-flood. They were built before the flood and they were used as a repository for ancient wisdom and knowledge. And unfortunately, he had no good evidence for that other than a theory and idea. And I just kind of had to look at him and say, I don't think so. Let me share with you a little bit about the pyramids and about what they're made of and about what they sit on top of, because we understand the pyramids, we understand the geology of the pyramids. And that's what we're going to mainly talk about tonight, the geology of the pyramids. Fortunately, we do have pretty good understanding of the geology of the pyramids and the landscape. We can trace out the rocks, we can do core samples and drilling and figure out not only what the pyramids are made of, but what's underneath the pyramids. And so when we examine the landscape, when we examine the Giza Plateau, we actually find that the Giza Plateau was made up of limestone and shale, and underneath that sandstone, we can see different layers of sediment that creation geologists across the board all agree was deposited during or after the flood in Noah's day. And so, how do you have the pyramids sitting on top of flood-laid sediment? You can't really do that because you can't put the cart before the horse. So when we begin to examine the landscape, we do see that the pyramids themselves sit on top of flood-laid layers of sedimentary deposits that we believe were deposited during the flood. And so again, you can't build the pyramids on top of the flood deposits until you get the flood. So in my mind, that kind of rules out the idea that the pyramids are a pre-flood structure. Not only that, but man, when you understand the mechanisms of the flood, we're talking about a worldwide catastrophic devastational event with tsunami-like waves slamming into the continents, currents of water circling the planet over 100 miles an hour. The Bible talks about mountains rising, valleys sinking. We're talking about a massive devastation event. I don't even believe the pyramids could have survived the flood. If mountains and formations were leveled during the flood, no way were these pyramids surviving. So we don't have any evidence of flood in the pyramids. There's no evidence of them being, covered by water, despite what you might see on some popular Facebook posts or some clickbait articles. We need to better examine these things, test these things. And so we don't see evidence of that. What we do see is that the pyramids sit on top of flood-laid sediment. And then when we examine the geology and the paleontology, like we're going to do tonight, it actually gets a lot clearer. So we're going to take you through a few really cool examples of some fossils that we find at the pyramids. So I've been to Egypt many times, and this last trip in November, I actually decided to walk around the Giza Plateau, not to look at the pyramids. I've seen those plenty of times. I wanted to look for the fossils. So I wanted to examine to see, because I know about some fossils, and every time I've been there, I've found fossils, but I've never actually like set out to specifically look for fossils. And there were actually one fossil example that I was really keen to find. And so this last trip was really a fossil hunt on the Giza Plateau of all things. And so I want to share with you guys a few things of what you can find if you ever come to visit Egypt with us. So here we go. First example of some fossils. If you're taking a look at this, this is kind of an interesting looking fossil. This is one of the most prominent fossil types we see there. We're actually going to go through a kind of a progression in my perspective, what I find the boringest, the least interesting fossils to the most exciting. But this is one of the first ones. It's kind of really cool, but it's small. They're small little pieces about the size of a dime to a quarter. Some are the size of a tiny little grain of rice or something like that. They're pretty small. And you're taking a look here, trying to figure out what in the world is this. In case you haven't figured out yet, these are what we refer to as nummalites or nummulites. And these are small little coin-shaped fossils. They're actually, fascinatingly enough, they are single-cell organisms. And I've seen some personally that are a little bit over the size of a quarter, yet it's still a single cell. So there's some, I believe, among some of the largest single-cell organisms that we see. Pretty fascinating. But these are small coin-shaped fossils. They look like a coin, which is why we get the name nummalite or nummulite. The same kind of root word where we get numismatic or a new, for coins and things like that, because they look like coins. And they're found all together, oftentimes washed together, sometimes broken, but they're pretty fascinating. You can find them in the blocks of the Sphinx. You can find them, in the Sphinx, the blocks of the pyramid. You can find them walking along on the ground. You can find them literally by the tens of thousands as you're walking around the Giza Plateau. They are everywhere. So these are nummalites or nummulites, and pretty cool little things you can find. A little cool spiral, and they grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. They start off really teeny tiny, and so if you see, there's some small little examples you can see here, and then they get bigger and bigger, and so you can see these are actually turned sideways. I think if I remember right, this picture I took by the Sphinx on the ground pavement there. This one was actually taken over by the Great Pyramid itself. But you can see this kind of spiral kind of growing, sort of getting bigger and bigger. So these are nummalites or nummulites, kind of a fascinating fossil you can find. Again, when we find fossils in creation geology, we typically believe that most fossils were formed probably during the flood or shortly thereafter. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. We have this formation that the pyramids are sitting on top of, and the limestone that they're built out of, called the Makatam Formation, which most creation geologists believe is probably post-flood. This is what we refer to as Eocene deposits. So the Eocene period, most of the creation geologists, at least that I work with, believe that the Eocene is shortly after the flood. Some believe that it may be during the flood, perhaps, but anyhow, not before the flood. So either flood or shortly thereafter, post-flood deposits, the Eocene deposits of this Makatam Formation that you can see, which is the limestone that the Giza Plateau is made of. That's where we find these fossils. So to us, it tells us that it was either during the flood when these were deposited or shortly thereafter, maybe by another regional catastrophic event. That's a whole nother talk for a whole nother night if we can talk about the Zanclean floods and a few things that may be some evidence of some other post-flood catastrophes in that region. Anyhow, this is one of the fossil examples that you can find if you're walking around on the Giza Plateau with us. In fact, if you're walking up to the Great Pyramid itself, and if you want to go inside, this is a picture I took right near the entrance to the Great Pyramid. As you're walking up the steps to go up to there, you can see some nummalites here that are actually kind of broken off in half. And so you're seeing it from a sideways angle, and they've actually been broken, but you can kind of see the inside of what it looks like. So if you're walking up to there, right before you get to the entrance into the Great Pyramid, you can actually see where these are at. Pretty fascinating. All right, the next fossil that we want to get to tonight is kind of what I like to call Christmas tree fossils. And this is kind of, it looks to me, looks a lot like a Christmas tree. These you can find not everywhere on the plateau, but you can find it in the pavement kind of rock that the pyramids are sitting on top of. These are actually found by the dozens over in the north, kind of a northeastern corner of the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And there are dozens and dozens of these fossils there that kind of look like little Christmas trees. And so I'm giving you a chance to kind of look at it, figure out, get your answers locked in as far as what you think this is. When I was out there, I looked at them, I saw them, and my first impression, probably clouded because I live and work at the Grand Canyon where we have these fossils, but I had thought at first these were nautiloids. And it looks like a nautiloid, which is a squid-like animal with little tentacles that come out the back. And I thought, oh, I've never heard of there being nautiloids on the Giza Plateau. This is fascinating. To me, it looked like nautiloids. Then I went back and researched a little bit, and they are not nautiloids, sorry to say. But they are referred to as turritella. Now, turritella are actually snails. They're not squid. They are a type of snail. They're kind of a conical snail with the name turritella, meaning basically a turret or a tower. And so that's why they're called turritella. They're spiral snails. Now, these are not great examples of what turritella typically look like. There's a tongue twister, huh? Turritella typically look like. So these are turritella that are kind of worn down and weathered. But we do have examples of other turritella fossils from the Eocene formation. And here's an example of what they might look like in a little bit better preserved example. These are also Eocene turritella fossils. And so you kind of see the spiral snail-like animals. These are marine snails. These are snails that live in the ocean, marine snails. And so the example there at the pyramid, you can see they're preserved differently in this kind of limestone, and they're definitely weathered out. They're basically just kind of a small trace fossil at this point. But anyhow, Torritella, kind of a fun fossil. This one actually comes from here in the United States. This is from the Green River Formation, but they're both Eocene, and so kind of fascinating. It's very similar looking fossils. Then we get to another really fascinating fossil, and this last trip in Egypt was the first time I actually saw these. This was just on the kind of east side of the Great Pyramid of Khufu in this area. Found this fossil, which you can see embedded in the rock over here. And so I put up a little guide there to kind of show you the size of it. Not too small, pretty good size, size maybe a small fist. And so we're looking at, oh, maybe 3 to 4 inches for most of the examples that I found. And again, I'm giving you time to kind of figure out what in the world this might be. I did post a picture recently on Facebook of either this one or another one that I found. And this is a great, beautiful fossil. In fact, there are many, many of these in this exact same location within the same 10 feet. This is, drum roll, a sea urchin. So this is a sea urchin. This is a type of echinoderm. And echinoderm basically meaning spiky skin animal, which includes things like starfish and also includes things like the sea slugs, I think it is, something like that. They're also echinoderms. And so this is kind of the remnant body of a type of sea urchin, you might say. And it's really fascinating, but they're really beautiful when you get up close to see them. And so I took a macro shot, a really close shot, and look at how beautiful that is. The design and just the intricacy is incredible. So this is another one. I think this is a different one, about 3 feet from the first one, but another one of those echinoderms, sea urchin type creatures that you see there. And it's interesting, when I was looking at this, it reminded me of the blue crown of Egypt, kind of the war crown they talk about. And here's a picture of what that looks like. And it reminded me of that. I'm like, huh, I wonder, did ancient Egypt get its inspiration for that blue crown from these, the sea creatures? Who knows? But it kind of fascinating, you see there. So this is an example of some of the fossils that we find there. Now, the last fossil that I want to share with you is actually my favorite, and it comes with a little bit of a story behind it. And this story has to do with my friend and a fellow tour guide that lives over there. And so his name is Henry Ayub. Henry is an Egyptian. He's an Egyptian tour guide, and I have been Facebook friends with Henry for many, many, many years. But I never met him in person. Every time I tried to come to Egypt, he was either busy or gone, or like I was in Cairo and he was in Luxor. And so we never have been able to connect. I was introduced to him from another great friend of mine here that lives in Flagstaff with us. And he's done tours with him. And I wanted to meet Henry for many, many years. Now, I was at the Egyptian Grand Museum for its opening week, just the first day that it actually was open to the public for its extended day time. I was there at that museum for 11 hours. And if you don't know me, you know that if you know me, you know I love museums. And so I was at the Grand Egyptian Museum for the opening week for 11 hours that day. And halfway through the day, I kind of was sitting down there resting and eating lunch, and I was looking through my phone and scrolling through Facebook, and I saw a post from Henry that he was at the museum. So I quickly messaged him on Facebook and said, "Hey, Henry, are you here? I'd love to say hi and connect with you." And he responded a little bit later, and he had just left. And so he was posting that picture as he left, and I didn't get a chance to see him. I'm like, we're in the same place, in the same museum. And I missed him by literally minutes. We probably could have walked right into each other. So I missed him, and I was like, bummer. Well, 2 days later, I was on the Giza Plateau doing this fossil scavenger hunt, looking for these fossils. And I've been there for probably about 3 or 4 hours at that point, and I was getting ready to leave the Great Pyramid and walk over to the Pyramid of Khafre. But one particular fossil that I was looking for that I'd heard about was a preserved dugong. And so a dugong is kind of like a manatee, okay? But it's a little bit different variety, but they're similar. Dugongs and manatees, both kind of sea cows. Well, I'd heard that in the ground right by the pyramid there was a dugong fossil, but I could not find it. If you've been to the pyramids, you know how big that place really is. And so I was walking around all morning, couldn't find this fossil, didn't know exactly where it was, but oh well. So I was getting ready to leave the Great Pyramid to walk over to the Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest pyramid. And as I'm walking, I'm leaving, just getting ready to leave, and I glance over. There's a tour guide with a group, and I heard him talking and he's speaking English, and so I kind of was listening as I'm walking by, and I kind of glanced over to see, who was talking to him. I paused and I said, "Wait a minute, that looks like Henry." And so I got a little bit closer, kind of did the circling thing around, and that is Henry. So I kind of waited just on the outside of the group, about 15, 20 feet away, just kind of waiting in the distance, not trying to draw attention. And he glances up and says, "Hey, everybody, this is my friend Nate. This is my Facebook friend." And so we come in there. He brings me into his group. He tells everyone about who I am, what I do. I tell everyone about how we connected. And I'm so excited because I almost missed Henry again. And I would have walked away, never seeing him probably that whole trip. And I'm there talking to Henry, and I'm talking to his group, and he's, fantastic. We're sharing. And I kid you not, guys, get this. As we're talking, I look down at my feet at the exact place where we're standing. I look down at my feet, and right there is the dugong fossil that I was looking for. Now, I got goosebumps, and I'm getting goosebumps right now because I believe in a miracle working God. I believe in a God who orchestrates and designs events and times and seasons and all this together. Had I not seen Henry over there talking to his group, I never would have found this fossil. I would have walked past it. I was on my way out. Henry was standing at the exact spot talking to his group. And I looked down as I'm talking to him. I took this picture while we're in conversation. I just like quickly took a picture to say, "Oh my goodness, this is the exact fossil that I found." And I, to this day, believe that God orchestrated that exact timing, that exact event. So this, my friends, is my favorite fossil, not because of the fossil, but because of the story behind it. But this is a dugong fossil, like a sea cow. What you're looking at here are some of the ribs of this dugong. And so you can see some rib bones here, it looks like. Maybe some paddle flipper finger bones. It looks like there's some fingers here. Perhaps not exactly sure how they're oriented. But maybe these are rib bones as well. I'm not exactly sure. You can tell that some of the bones have actually been taken out by people, but this is what's remaining there. But fascinating, this is a mammal like a sea cow. They talk about like a dugong, like a manatee, like a lot of you guys in Florida may have seen. This is there, and so here's another close-up picture of some of those bones. This is the only mammal fossil that I found on the Giza Plateau anywhere, and so this is fascinating. Again, these are creatures that we believe were either buried during the flood or shortly after the flood that lived in this region. And so again, this gives us good evidence with the fossil record, with the paleontology, good evidence that the pyramids themselves, if they're built on top of this stuff, and if the blocks of the pyramids contain these kind of fossils, it gives us an understanding that yeah, the pyramids were not a pre-flood for construction. They definitely date to after the flood. And again, unfortunately, I almost every week run into articles or posts from people that get a lot of traction. They get a lot of wow and excitement, and people that like to say, "Yeah, great, pre-flood pyramids, hidden knowledge, secret stuff," and it's kind of like this modern Gnosticism where we have secret knowledge that we just love to hold on to. And as you guys know today in our conspiracy theory driven world, there's a lot of that going on. So we look at the evidence. The evidence shows us that yes, the pyramids were built by the Egyptians and that they are, in fact, a construction that was after the flood in Noah's day. So then another question that we typically get oftentimes related to the Giza Plateau, related to Egypt, talked a little bit about the pyramids and the geology of the pyramids, but then the other question that we get, and has actually gotten really popular lately, is, well, what about the Sphinx? People have lots of questions about the Sphinx. And if you watch videos on YouTube and places like that, or any shows on TV, they might talk about all kinds of ideas about the Sphinx. And they examine the Sphinx, and there are ideas out there that, well, maybe the Sphinx predates the pyramids. And I've heard people claiming that the Sphinx is 8 to 10,000 years old. And the Great Sphinx was far older than the pyramids, and it has evidence of being covered by water. There's water damage, isn't it? Maybe it was originally a lion and then recarved as a human head. Maybe it was from a lost civilization. And if you are here tonight, and if you're sitting in this audience, and if you are one of those who believe those ideas, I have one word for you: stop. We don't need that. We have good evidence, again, that dispels all of those notions when it comes to the building of the creation of the Sphinx. So when we examine the Sphinx, we do see that, yes, there does seem to be a lot of weathering, a lot of erosion. If you look at the body of the Sphinx, it looks very different than the head. As we zoom in here, you'll see the head is actually better preserved, you might say. It's less damaged, it's less weathered than the body of the Sphinx. But that doesn't mean that it was pre-flood, covered by the flood. It doesn't mean that it was 8 to 10,000 years old when we had this great rainy season period in Egypt, like some people like to say on the internet. It doesn't mean that it predates the Egyptians. None of those conspiracies hold water when it comes to the water damage of the flood, or water damage of the Sphinx, you might say. So when we examine the Sphinx, what we find is there are reasons why the Sphinx has this kind of damage that's a little bit different than the pyramids. So one of those things is, if we examine the Sphinx, we can see that the geological makeup of the Sphinx is very different than the pyramids. The pyramids are built of blocks of limestone, most of them that were cut right there on the plateau from the Giza Plateau limestone, with white limestone casing blocks from Tura, or in some places some granite even on the outside. Those are blocks that were cut, moved, and placed on top of the Giza Plateau. The Sphinx is very different. The Sphinx was actually carved from the block of limestone itself. And in fact, most likely, there's good evidence, I believe, that the head of the Sphinx was actually a big, rounded, natural boulder that was sitting up there above the sand. And maybe they recognized that and said, oh, that looks kind of like a head. And they carved it down from that point downwards and developed and carved the Sphinx as they went down. There's good evidence that that actually, from the neck up, was actually sitting on top of the land as a natural big rock boulder. So as they carved down through the limestone, they actually carved out of the limestone the Sphinx. They carved an enclosure, like a big box around the Sphinx. It wasn't built on top of the layers of limestone. It actually was made from the limestone as they excavated and cut around it to leave this behind. Now, there are different members and rock units, different sedimentary layers you can even see within the Sphinx itself. So different members that you see there. And the Sphinx, because the Sphinx is not a separate block sitting on top of the plateau, but it's actually made from the plateau, there's an interesting thing that happens with the Sphinx. It tends to suck up a lot of water and moisture from the ground table of water. Now, I said the Sphinx has been cut out from the surrounding limestone rock, and it actually sits down into a basin, into a depression where water naturally collects. Now, I've been in Egypt in the rainy season in the winter. I've been there when we've had some massive rainstorms. I have personally seen water collected and pooled and ponded up at the base of the Sphinx. And that giant limestone block of the Sphinx, what it tends to do, it sucks that water up. It kind of naturally wicks up into the Sphinx. And so we see it actually kind of pull this up. And so the water's drawn up into there. And we know that process happens. We can actually see, you can have experiments. So you can see here where a block of stone was set in a puddle of water. And in about half a minute, you can see the water line coming up here at the bottom. 18 minutes later, the water is actually kind of sucked up to there. And then about a little over an hour later, you can actually see where this whole thing is actually sucking up water. And so this water is kind of sapping into there. And the rock itself is drawing the water up through kind of capillary action and it's pulling that water up. It's similar to how trees actually drink water from the ground. This kind of capillary water action is being drawn from the roots, and the leaves are drawing it on top, which actually creates a kind of a suction effect. The same thing would happen with the Sphinx. The Sphinx sitting there on the plateau, because it's connected to the actual limestone, water and moisture in the water table is down there, or when the Nile River was closer to the Sphinx, or when this rainwater comes and collects near the bottom of it, the whole Sphinx itself tends to suck that water up. It wicks up into there and is drawn up into the body of the Sphinx by capillary action. Now, because of that, it actually creates a lot more erosion and weathering of the Sphinx. It dissolves the bonds that are holding the minerals together of the Sphinx, and it tends to flake away and to break away a lot more than what you might see with the pyramids. And so the Sphinx actually sucks up water from the bottom. So it might be appropriate for us to say tonight, one time, the Sphinx sucks. And it does. It sucks up water from the ground table, and it brings into its body that. Now, also around the Sphinx, where you see here, we have this is the back side of the Sphinx. This is actually part of the wall, the blocks where they cut the enclosure of the Sphinx. This is near the top. But the first time I was in Egypt, I said, wait a minute. You see all these little vertical channels? I know what that is. These are actually fluid escape features. And you can actually see, if you especially know geology, you can see that there's a little bit of a differential line going across here. This is a weaker area of limestone where this line is at. Above that, we get a little bit firmer limestone. Below that, a little bit firmer limestone. Another weaker area, another section. So these are actually kind of sedimentary kind of units within there. And this line right here shows a fairly weak area. It also shows where the water table, where water has actually traveled through the rock horizontally. And as it traveled through the rock, through kind of the water table line, because this whole section is cut out and cut as a vertical face, that water then poured out of here. So what you're looking at is times when rainwater was collecting on top, running down through the water table in the plateau, and as it traveled downhill, eventually got to this area where the water traveling through this kind of porous section of rock now just poured out of there. And so you're looking at where water would actually travel out in tiny little micro waterfalls, you might say, and it creates these little hole pockets and comes down here. I have seen these exact same vertical, fluid escape features in the Grand Canyon many places. I've seen it predominantly in the Kaibab limestone, where we see many of these vertical fluid escape features with kind of a rounded section up top where the main water began to pour out, and then it cut a little channel as it drained through here. So this is actually in the enclosure of the Sphinx, which tells me, well, there's a lot more water going on than we even expected. It's not just rainwater, and it's not just water soaking up from underneath. There's actually water that's continually being added, and you can actually see this slope right here where all kinds of debris has been washing down. Whenever it rains, it washes more water into the enclosure of the Sphinx, and that Sphinx soaks up more water. And so that in turn helps create more of an eroded body to the Sphinx. It's not because the Sphinx is 8 to 10,000 years old or was existing in a time frame when there was much more rain. They kind of talk about this period in Earth's ancient past if you watch some of those conspiracy theory videos. 10,000 years ago during a rainy period and before Egypt even existed, there was a pre-Egyptian civilization that's now lost. Nope, none of those ideas hold water. So, what does hold water is what we see today, rain that comes through here, water that travels into the Sphinx, soaking up water. And another interesting fact about the Sphinx, few people probably realize this, but for the majority of the life of the Sphinx, most of it's actually been buried in sand. For most of the Sphinx's life, its body was actually covered by sand. This is an early example. This goes back to the 1800s before they actually went through and excavated and dug out the enclosure around the Sphinx. Most of the life of the Sphinx, it was actually covered in sand. This is wind-blown sand from great desert dunes that blow into the enclosure box around it, and it fills it up to the regular, typical ground level. Most of the body of the Sphinx is underneath the sand. Now, it's actually been cleared out multiple times going back in history, and the earliest known record of this kind of clearing out and restoring and unburying of the Sphinx goes all the way back to the 1400s BC to a person who would become pharaoh, Thutmose IV. Now, Thutmose IV is the son of the pharaoh that many of us believe was a pharaoh of the Exodus. So from my perspective, many people we work with, we believe that Amenhotep is the best candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus right around the year 1446 BC. His son, Tutmosis IV, was the next one to become king, to become pharaoh. And there's a story that he tells, and his story, in his own words, talks about the fact that he was driving his chariot, racing around the Giza Plateau, looking at the monuments. And at that point, the pyramids were quite old already at that point. The Sphinx was quite old at that point, and the Sphinx was actually covered by sand. And at that point, probably up to its neck, a little bit higher than what you see even in this picture. Anyhow, Tutmos talks about the fact that around noon he began to be tired. The noonday sun was beating down upon him. So he actually laid down to rest in the shadow of the Sphinx. And as he slept, he says that while he slept, he had a dream. And in this dream, the Sphinx spoke to him. The Sphinx came and it spoke to him, and it told him that if he would uncover the body of the Sphinx and restore him, that he would be named and become the next pharaoh. So he does that, and apparently he becomes pharaoh. Now, interesting story, but that's the story that he recounts. He basically dug out the Sphinx and became the next pharaoh, which is also fascinating in biblical archaeology and history because Tutmosis IV became the next pharaoh after Amenhotep II. But, friends, he was not in line to become the next pharaoh. He actually had an older brother that is mentioned in the Egyptian records, the firstborn son of Amenhotep II, who's mentioned and referred to, but then suddenly disappears from the scene, like almost like he died. Now, what does that sound like? Sounds exactly the scenario we see in the book of Exodus with the death of the firstborn son of the Pharaoh. Suddenly, this secondborn son, Amenhotep IV, is thrust into the limelight, becomes the next Pharaoh, becomes the next king. We don't know exactly why he wrote this account in the story, but there's actually a stela, a monument, right between the paws of the Sphinx by Tutmosis IV. This story is written there. You can see it when you go to look at the Sphinx. We don't know exactly why he wrote it. Some people believe maybe he wrote it because he was trying to rationalize to the common people why he became the pharaoh and why the gods actually chose him and not another. And it could be that he made the story up just to kind of help support that idea. But who knows? Maybe it could be that God gave him a dream and God in some way told him, you will be the next pharaoh. I don't know the exact scenario there. But the fascinating thing is this son of Amenhotep II, who was not destined to become pharaoh, became the next pharaoh after his older brother disappeared from the scene. And he did that, says, after he dug out the Sphinx. So over the years, the Sphinx has been buried by sand. Now, what does that do? If you've got a box that's cut out and then you've got sand filling the box, the limestone bed is still connected in the Sphinx, but any rainwater that goes and hits that sand is going to percolate down, and that sand, that wet sand, is going to hold moisture up against the body of the Sphinx. You saw earlier how the head of the Sphinx is not very eroded and weathered, but the body is. That's because the head of the Sphinx was kept above the sand line for many, many years, for literally hundreds or even thousands of years, whereas the body was underneath the sand, soaking up the water from below, water pouring into it from the side cuts of the box, water held wet, moist sand against it. And so what's happening is the actual sand grains are holding water up against the limestone of the body, causing it to weather and to erode a lot more. Now, I've seen this kind of exact thing happen in real life. When we talk about places like the Grand Canyon, where we live and work, we have there the Great Unconformity, and underneath us here, we've talked about the Great Unconformity before. We have the kind of quartzite basement rocks of the Grand Canyon. We have right here a dividing line where we actually see the beginning of what's called the Tapeats sandstone. And I know a Melody, who's on here with us tonight, has been here to this exact spot. We got pictures of her at this exact location right here. But this is the Great Unconformity. We believe where the beginning of the flood is at. From this line up, this is the Tapeats sandstone. And if you know things about geology, this is the basal Sock sandstone from the Sock megasequence. This is kind of the basal sandstone unit of the Cambrian. And so this is a layer of rock that covers North America. It covers multiple continents. I've actually seen it in Egypt itself. But here, the sandstone, fairly strong. But when I took a trip over to Wisconsin, I went to another place that has the Great Unconformity, to Devil's Lake State Park near Baraboo, Wisconsin. Right there, they also have the Great Unconformity. They also have the Baraboo quartzite, that same purplish looking quartzite I see at the Grand Canyon all the time. And they also have the same Tapeats sandstone equivalent. But when I picked up a piece of that Tapeats sandstone, I was amazed because this rock that I'm used to seeing is pretty strong, hard rock. When I picked it up over in Wisconsin, first of all, it was wet, it was damp, it was moist. And when I picked it up, it started to crumble in my hands. This same rock that is usually really strong was now very, very friable. It was very crumbly and breaking apart. And that's because the sand grains were being broken apart, broken down because of the moisture and the water that this area has. It's a lot more humid, a lot more wet, a lot more moist. And so what happens is when you get things like sandstone or other rocks that are saturated by water, it can reduce the strength by like 75% because the water breaks down the bonding gluing agents like calcite that helps hold these mineral grains together. And so here, the same piece of rock that's usually really strong that I'm used to is now literally falling apart in my hand. And so I started thinking, well, back to the pyramids, that's the same thing we would see there. When you look at the pyramids, we look at the Sphinx is wet, it's moist, the body is kept moist. And so because of that, it's breaking down a lot quicker. Now, the last and final thing regarding these pyramids that makes them different by why the pyramids are not as weathered and worn compared to the Sphinx, and why some people have tried to propose that the Sphinx is thousands of years older than the pyramids even. But one thing that's actually helped the pyramids survive weathering and erosion is the limestone casing that used to cover most of the pyramid. See, the pyramid blocks in the middle, most of the bulk, the body of the pyramid is actually made up of limestone blocks from the Giza Plateau. They're kind of yellowish limestone blocks that you see there. And these are Giza Plateau limestone blocks, big square blocks. But the casing, the finishing stone on the outside, that's kind of cut and made a line that goes to the top of the pyramids. This is cut white limestone from Tura. And the Tura limestone actually is much more dense, it's much stronger, it's less porous, it's more beautiful. It's whitish in color typically, but it's also more beautiful and it helps preserve and protect things. Because the grain structure of this, like I said, is much more dense and strong. It actually was covering the pyramid and would create this kind of casing stone that over thousands of years actually helped preserve and protect the outside of the pyramid. Here you can see a remnant example you can see there. So the white limestone, Tura limestone helped preserve and protect the pyramids. Nowadays, we kind of look at the pyramid like the middle pyramid of Khafre here. You can actually see a little bit of that limestone covering near the very top here. This is part of the white Tura limestone that still remains. Most of the rest of it had fallen down, and people also went up there and collected it and harvested it and used it for other building projects over the years. But this was actually taken down, but it used to be covered in this brilliant white limestone. And so for thousands of years, the blocks that we see today were actually preserved and protected. However, that was very different for the Sphinx. The Sphinx was not preserved and protected, which is why when we look at the body of the Sphinx, you can see there's a lot more weathering, a lot more erosion. Not because it's much, much older, not because it's 8 to 10,000 years old or existed long before the pyramids, not because of not because it was covered by the flood or anything like that. There's really good scientific geological understandings and reasons why we see the the Sphinx body much more weathered and eroded. And so good evidence. When you actually just go and examine it, come with us, take a look. We'll show you what we're talking about here. So regarding the pyramids, regarding the Sphinx, as we look at the time, getting ready to wrap up right here, we have really good evidence geologically regarding the pyramids, regarding the monuments on the Giza Plateau that yes, they are man-made, they are post-flood, they contain fossils, they sit on top of flood layers built during the Fourth Dynasty. When we actually examine the evidence, we can see that the evidence lines up, and it lines up with what we see with Egyptian, chronology, Egyptian history. It lines up with what we see in Scripture in the Bible. And if you ever come to the pyramids, I know we want to look up at the pyramids and we want to see how big and grand they are, but anytime I travel anywhere, I'm always looking down as well because the geologist side of me wants to look for the rocks. We want to look at the fossils. I want to examine that. So if you ever visit the Giza Plateau, look up and look down, my friends, because the story of the Giza Plateau is also below your feet. So as we get ready to leave the Giza Plateau, like all the Bedouin and all the tourist people do typically at the end of the day, I'll show you this beautiful video of a camel train that I took last time I was there. As everybody leaves the plateau, you actually kind of go downhill from this point, and we're looking out toward Cairo. And so as we wrap up this talk tonight, wrap up with the beautiful sunset over the pyramids from a hotel I stayed at one time. You can see here again the plateau uplifted, the Giza Plateau, the pyramids up there. And as we fade off into the sunset, I hope this gives you an understanding of some of the geology of the Giza Plateau, a little bit of the archaeology, a little bit of the paleontology, and some fun facts regarding it. Not just monuments, not just things, but some fantastic geology of the the Giza Plateau, geology of the Giza Plateau, or as I like to say, a big block rock talk. And there you go. There you have it, my friends. And I think we might have some time for some questions, and I'll go ahead and stop this right here.
Well, thank you, Nate. Really fascinating. Of course, I'm sitting over here on my other computer right next to me, kind of looking at some AI stuff as well to ask some questions about this, which was a lot of fun to, add a few things to what you were saying, like the dream
Yeah.
that the Pharaoh had and stuff like that. But I do have some questions, so let me start out
All
reading
right.
them. I did put the EgyptChristianTours.com into the chat, so people had a way of
Okay.
looking for that. Okay, and from Alpha Rat, we have this question. I have heard that the Freemasons have claimed that they built the pyramids. Do you have any ideas about this?
I have not personally heard the Freemasons build pyramids. I don't know. I don't really study the Freemasons very much. It's not my kind of my area of apologetics and studying. As far as I knew,
Right.
the Freemasons claim going all the way back to the time of Solomon, but interesting. Yeah, well, unfortunately, a lot of the claims of the Freemasons, there's a lot of, I would say, my opinion, bogus stuff out there for that. Definitely no evidence that we have of the Freemasons building the pyramids or anything of that, I would say. Strictly Egyptians, Egyptian craftsmen, Egyptian workers, and yes, there were slaves that the Egyptians also employed to help build them as well. All of the above, but I've never heard anything about any Freemasons building them.
Yeah, and of course you have the documentation that you've recently discovered, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. What type of writing is inside um, I guess the pyramids? What
hmm
type of writing?
So the writing that I pointed out to there, and the writing that I've seen images of, is again kind of that hieratic style writing of the Egyptians, like basically Egyptian hieroglyphic, like cursive writing or shorthand writing. It's the writing used by the common people, what they would read and write. Most Egyptians didn't typically write the standard, beautiful hieroglyphic language. That was usually by scribes and by priests and things like that. That was used for like royal documentation. Commonly, they wrote kind of a shorthand version of that called hieratic, and that's what we see inside that was written by the workers of the pyramids. The work gangs and the friends of Khufu wrote in that language there, or that same language, but kind of a different script.
Okay. Also, the question is what are they using to say that the pyramids? She says, "I know that someone in the room wants to know more about the pyramids not being pre-flood." So, who's who's saying that? It's not in the creationist camp, I wouldn't think.
Someone in, I think what we talked about tonight was that the pyramids are not pre-flood. That's pretty much the majority of the talk is that the pyramids are not pre-flood, and that's some of the reasons behind that.
Based on the fossil records
Based on the
and
fossil record, based on the sedimentary rock layers of sandstone, limestone that creation geologists would believe were deposited either during the flood or after the flood. Yeah, so really good evidence geologically, especially if we stick to a biblical creation perspective of geology,
right.
that pyramids post-date that. Plus the fact that Misraim, Egypt, is mentioned as, a descendant there of Ham coming from the flood. So we don't even get Egypt until after the flood. And we have good evidence that the Egyptians built the pyramids. So hopefully that answers that question. If not, maybe somebody didn't tune in at the beginning of the talk, but
Well, they
uh,
might have been
yeah,
distracted or something and
yeah.
not heard some of that. Okay, next question was by Scott A. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but anyway, he says Dr. Lyle, the astrophysicist, said the pyramid was built lined up to the North Star, which he said was a new star after the flood. He dates the pyramid to 300 years after Noah. You heard that?
I do know that, yeah, there's orientations of the pyramid that they align to the north, which today is our North Star Polaris. When the pyramids were built, there was a different star called Thuban that was actually the North Star. We have what's called axial precession, where kind of a spinning wobble of the Earth kind of points kind of where our North Pole, axis points to, and it kind of rotates a little bit. Today, our North Star Polaris is that North Star. If we roll the clock back to the Egyptian times, again, Thuban would have been the star. It was a North Star, just different than we have today. I don't know about if it was a star after the flood, if that didn't appear till then. I don't know. It seems like that's what the question is saying. He said it was a new star after the flood. I haven't heard that from Jason, but I would love to talk to him about that. That's fascinating. I do know that the pyramids, like many other monumental structures, are aligned kind of north, south, east, west,
Yeah.
and a lot of the monuments are actually aligned so that there's a shaft that points to the North Star area and to these kind of indestructible stars, they call it, the stars that never set below the horizon but rotate around the North Star, because they believe that the soul, the Ka or Ba of the pharaoh goes into the sky and becomes one of those stars, and so they
Mm.
travel up to there, so they point in that direction. So there's a lot of stuff tied to that, and they're really accurate with their angles of degrees and things like that when it comes to alignments of north and south and east and west. And so it's interesting. I'll have to ask Dr. Lyle about the star if he believes that it was after the flood when it appeared. That would be an interesting
Actually,
thing.
I can answer that, and I actually posted the answer in
Oh,
the
did you?
in the chat there too. But he says that the star Thuban was once the North Star. The Earth's
Hmm.
axis drifts over the centuries, and it once pointed at Thuban. One shaft in the pyramids is aligned with where Thuban would have been shortly after the flood, thereby establishing an approximate date for the construction of the pyramids.
Bingo. Whew. I am glad that my what I just said is confirmed by an astrophysicist. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Thuban would be that North Star in the past, and he's exactly right. We can look at alignments of things to even help give us a dating for when things may have happened. So I think maybe that's what he's talking about. The alignment of the pyramids to Thuban may be what he's pointing at, and so that helps give us a date for when it actually would have been built. I use that same thing even out here for Native American archaeology. I look at when monuments were built out here 800, 900 years ago because some of the alignments are slightly different. And so it has to do with things like, solstices and events like that where they're making alignments. But that was great. I'm glad Dr. Lyle is what he said there because that makes a lot more sense to seem like what the question is asking.
Okay. The next question, the dugong, is it the manatee with a different name? I ask this because they find manatee fossils um, that are the same, or are they different? I guess that's the question.
Yeah.
Maybe
So
Terry can clarify that.
dugongs and manatees are different. So they're both in, I believe it's called the Sirena family. And so they are similar but different. And I'm trying to remember all the differences, but I think like one of them has a tail that goes up and down, one has a tail that goes sideways or something. There's a little bit different, and the head is slightly different on both of them. So like especially around in Florida, we've got manatees down there.
Yeah.
And over in the Red Sea and that region around there, we actually have dugongs. Interestingly enough, when it comes to the building of the tabernacle, there is a little bit of a debate on a certain type of animal skin that was used to help cover the tabernacle. Some Bible translations translate it as a badger, some translate it as a porpoise, some translate it as a dugong. It could have been that the Hebrew people, while they're wandering in the wilderness, actually used dugong skins to help make the covering of the tabernacle. Kind of fascinating. So we do know that they were in the area. Fairly large animals can make good skin from, who knows, and naturally waterproof, it would seem. So my money is on dugong, but it's kind of an unknown word in the Hebrew language that people kind of debate. So anyhow, dugongs and manatees are in the same family. They're very similar, but they are different species.
Okay. Next question by Pateo, I think. It says, interesting. Was the Sphinx actually an image of Caffrey?
Ah, great question. We believe so. We do have statues of King Khafre, and they do have the similar features to the Sphinx. And we believe the Sphinx was actually built for Khafre's pyramid. It's aligning with it. There's a temple down below and a processional road that goes up to Khafre's pyramid in the middle, and it goes right past the Sphinx. And it's almost like the Sphinx is guarding his pyramid. And that's what Sphinx were designed to be. They were designed to be guardians, and so the alignment makes sense, the positioning makes sense, and the facial images of what we see from him and there do make sense. I've got some pictures I could always share with you guys of what Khafre would have looked like, or at least what the monuments show. And there's a lot of similarities. So yeah, they've drawn some conclusions where that probably was built for Khafre, like we believe.
Okay, I think that I've seen some stuff on the History Channel or something with some animations back then that they looked at.
Yeah.
Okay. Now he's made a statement just following that question, a yardang. You know what he means?
Yeah, I know what he means.
Okay.
Love it. So is it a yardang? So a yardang is I can't remember who wrote it exactly, but I think it was about 2 years ago. There was a paper that came out by two different folks that believed that the Sphinx and its body was naturally a yardang. Now, a yardang is basically a natural rock formation that's been shaped and sculpted typically by wind. And so the idea in their paper that was published was saying that maybe wind had naturally shaped this body of the Sphinx to a degree, and that the Egyptians saw it and said, "Oh, that's naturally shaped," and they began to actually carve it out looking like that. Now, I have written some rebuttals to that in the past because the reason I would say it's not a yardang, at least the body is not, is that the body itself is actually sitting inside a cut enclosure. So the natural ground level is right near the neck level. You have to cut down into the earth to get the body cut out of it. That was one reason I don't think it's a yardang. The other reason is I looked at the prevailing winds in Egypt, and prevailing winds do not blow in the right direction for the Sphinx to be a yardang. They actually blow the opposite. And it didn't seem like any of that was mentioned in the paper that I read about the proposal that it was a yardang. Now, I do believe that the head itself was probably, you might consider a yardang. The head may have been a natural head-shaped boulder, big round boulder, and they saw that sitting up above the ground. Maybe it was shaped by the wind a little bit. Maybe it looked kind of like a head, and they said, "Oh, let's carve down and make this into to a monument." That could be, but I don't see good evidence for the body being shaped. And I think that was the main proposal in the article and some of the videos that came out was that the body was shaped by the wind. And I say, well, the body actually sits below the top level of limestone, and the wind's blowing the exact opposite direction to carve it as a yardang. So I don't believe it is, but I do believe the head probably was a partial yardang, or at least a boulder that sat up there naturally exposed and shaped by the elements. So great. I'm glad somebody mentioned that. I didn't know if anybody would think
Hmm.
about that or ever mention that. So looks like Pateo. Way to go.
Yeah. Pateo's got a follow-up too. He said, "Have you considered the similarities in design between the pyramids and the Sumerian ziggurats?"
I have. Oh yeah. And I would personally say that they are not similar. I know that even in the creation groups, there's a lot of ideas out there that, well, the pyramids are designed after what the Tower of Babel would have looked like, and the pyramid structures are all designed after Babel. And I just, as an archaeologist in the studies, I don't see good evidence for that. Pyramids are easy to build. That's probably why we have them in multiple cultures. It's the easiest, most stable structure to build. And we actually see kind of a development, almost if we can use the word tonight, an evolution of the pyramids, starting with shaft cut tombs that were like dug in the ground or pits that were then covered by flat stones called mastabas. And then they begin to stack mastaba stones on top. And so we see like, the bigger and grander a king became, he wanted to showcase his tomb. We see stacked stone mastabas until we get to the stepped pyramid that we see in Saqqara. And that step pyramid that we see there from Pharaoh Djoser is actually the first real pyramid, you might say. It's the first pyramid structure on Earth, the oldest that we know of. That's actually built as stacked mastabas. He has a shaft tomb in the bottom, and on top of it is a stone covering and another stone covering. These get smaller and smaller and smaller until you get a pyramid. Now, the difference I would say between the pyramids here and what we see over there in Mesopotamia with ziggurats is not just the design, but even the purpose. Ziggurats are designed to be places of worship. They're cultic worship sites and centers. The pyramids in Egypt are tombs. We have good evidence. We still see a lot of the evidence for the tombs. So the purpose, the reason, and the construction, if you look at ziggurats, they have a temple on top of them. You got steps leading up on the outside, a temple on top. Pyramids are just very, very different. The only similarity is that they're triangle shaped. And if that's the only similarity that you see, it's probably not a good similarity to say that one came from the other or that they come to the Tower of Babel. We don't even know what the Tower of Babel was like. Some people
Hmm.
think it may have been a ziggurat. It could have been, but since we don't have it, we don't know. My personal opinion is that I just don't see good evidence for the idea that all pyramids around the world come from the idea of the Tower of Babel. And I know that's probably an unpopular, thing to say tonight, but again, I try to examine the evidence and what they were used for. And again, the development of them, we see a pretty good history of development of pyramids, of trial and error. And they just don't seem to match the ziggurats that we see over there. That's my opinion on it. Yeah.
Okay. And in the constraint of time here, I'm going to probably ask for a little bit quicker answers to some of these following questions. And in the chat afterwards, we can maybe discuss some more. So please touch on the recent SAR Doppler tomography detecting massive deep underground structure below the Khafre pyramid.
Yeah. So my official answer tonight is I don't know. When it first came out, of course, like most other Egyptologists and people that study them over there, like dear friend Zahi Hawass, we all said, no way, this is ridiculous craziness. I'm still doubting it, but I have seen some recent evidence that's actually other people are coming on board and other tests apparently have been going on there, that they may have found something under there. And again, if you look at the size of the pyramids, the work that it took to build on top, and the fact that they had already been building like shaft tombs that go down hundreds of feet into the ground, some cases, or at least, about 100 feet perhaps. They could have dug some things below there that we just don't know about. There is a giant shaft. Actually, as you're walking down by Khafre, we can actually see a giant shaft called the Osiris shaft. They dug deep into the ground. I don't know. That's kind of my official answer tonight, Steve, is I'm leaning against it, but I'm not willing to rule it out. I would like to see more research and work done on it.
Right. But you're probably going to rule out aliens.
Definitely gonna rule out aliens. Yeah,
Okay.
that's a whole different talk for a different night. But yeah, let's rule that.
Okay.
Steve, why
Yeah,
don't you go ahead and ask Melody's question, and then we'll wrap up the public live stream.
sure. Okay. So her question is, how far does the Tapete sandstone cover approximately?
So the Tapete Sandstone covers most of North America. On the coastal margins, we don't find it there because as floodwaters rained off the continents, it's scoured down to sea level, so scouring away that. But it blankets most of North America. We find it all the way across North Africa. We find it into southern Israel, where Timna is at. We actually have the Great Unconformity. Melody, you've seen it over there when you're in Jordan because it's also what Petra is carved into. And so Petra is carved into the same Tapete sandstone equivalent over there. I believe, I think it's called the Nubian sandstone over there, if I'm not mistaken, but it might be a different name. It's also found going further than that, and I recently heard that it's been found and mapped all the way into China. So we're talking about a cross-continental, in other words, almost like a worldwide blanket of fast-moving water-laid sandstone. Tell me there wasn't a flood, right? And so you can look up some maps. I think who is it? ICR actually has a pretty good map on that I think Warner Davis has put together for us. And you can see the map of that, or just shoot me a message or email. I've got some pictures and images of the blanketing of the tapetes. You'd find it fascinating because it actually is underneath your house up there too.
Did they cover that in the billions of what's my book there? Thousands, not billions.
I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they covered some of that stuff as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna read our final statement that we make at the end of these videos, and then if you would close us in prayer, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. We are Creation Fellowship Santee, and you can find us on Facebook, and all our video platforms like BitChute, Rumble, and YouTube are found at www.tinyurl.com/CFS archives. Please subscribe to our channels and like the videos as it helps us get the word out that our Christian faith is not a blind faith, but solidly based in evidence and reality from the very first verse of the Holy Bible. Please close us in prayer, Nate.
And Nate, before you pray, if you could go ahead and remind people how they can find your ministry as well too.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So canyonministries.org, that's the main website. That's what we typically do. That's stuff at the Grand Canyon and creation tours that we do daily, river trips, backpacking trips, tours along the rim. And then also, if you ever want to join us internationally, you can come over to England with me and take you through London on a week-long London Christian tour. So that's londonchristiantours.com, or Egypt. EgyptChristianTours.com. And so love for you guys to connect. And we're also on Facebook, so you can look me up, Nate Loper on Facebook, all the other fun social media stuff. We're out there too. So fantastic. Yeah, I'll close in prayer and then I will stick around as long as you guys want for any open Q&A or any discussion, things like that. Let's
Thank you.
pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that we can trust your word. Your word is reliable, your word is truth, your word is foundation. God, thank you that what we see in your words reflected in the world around us, in rocks, in space, astronomy, biology, geology, everywhere we look, we see your fingerprint, we see the handiwork of you, our Creator God. Thank you, God, that we can gather together to learn more about you, to study your world, and to see the amazing things that you reveal to us. God, thank you for this time that we've had, and may we just be blessed by studying you, learning about the things you have for us, and that we as your children would grow in wisdom and knowledge of who you are. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go ahead and stop recording.